I suppose one has to be technically competent to operate this. So nice to see you all, and some of you I haven't seen for some years. I remember 20 years ago I was in Mary Helen Brown's home in Houston, Texas. How nice to see you. I hope I can reach all of you as you're widespread. This talk is titled, Does a New Race of Men Begin with a New Generation of Parents as Educators? Among other things, this paper is about learning in early childhood and the effects it has on brain development. It suggests that learning in early childhood is not early learning. It is on time. In other words, because of what are called critical periods in the brain's development, later than early is too late. It is a paper which makes distinctions between the miseducation of children, putting preschoolers at risk emotionally and psychologically, and what Abdu'l-Baha says Baha'i children should learn at that age and even earlier. It is a paper which makes connections between the hurried child and the hurried parent, connections between the retarded child or the slow child, what most people call the normal child, and the lack of enriching experiences during infancy. By slow, I mean that it takes them a year to do what a Baha'i child should do in a month. Since most children don't get the kind of enriching experiences I will be discussing, deprivation is the norm for most children. Therefore, statistically speaking, it may be more accurate to say, by Baha'i criteria, that the normal child is a slow child, is retarded or held back in some way. Thus, the paper makes connections between the necessity of rich learning experiences during infancy and the accelerated abilities which Abdu'l-Baha desires for Baha'i children. This is a paper which discusses literacy, not as a skill, but as a brain function, and as an attribute of what it means to be a human being, and which, like language itself, is uniquely or distinctly a part of the human design or template. As such, we will examine reading, not as a goal or subject to be learned, but as something which may be fundamental to other types of brain functioning, to intellectual capacity, and to general intelligence and understanding, even as a prerequisite to some higher order cognitive functioning, and ultimately to spiritual progress and growth. This is a paper on spiritual education and the powerful effects of the creative word in the development of a child's mind, self-concept, and identity. Finally, this is a paper on the crucial role of parents in the generation of new intelligence, of new emotions, and of moral competence, as first educators of children who, without a well-planned program during the first 5 years of life, may not be equal to the emergencies and problems confronting the planet during their lifetime. In short, this is a paper grappling with the requirements for the making of a human being. And it asks the question whether a new race of men must not begin with a new generation of parents, and whether Baha'i scholars and educators have a role in the process of this parent education. I ask your indulgence because this paper is going to sort of be read as a left brain activity. It relies heavily on your attention auditorially, and our whole seminar has made some efforts and expressed concern about having it more whole brain and more right brain, and the whole day, I think, has a number of portions to get dedicated to that. So I'll ask your tolerance in the name of diversity. Hopefully this will be the most left brain thing you have to do.
This is the male portion of our
Right. Okay. I also ask your indulgence on the matter of logistics. This is with regard to the concern some of us have for removing the sexist overtones in English literature. We are not so fortunate as the Persians, whose language has no sex in third person. A disclaimer for this paper seems less maddening than the efforts to include both genders in every third person of the language, which is not gender neutral. She/he only works occasionally, and good literature depends on avoiding such cumbersome devices. It's equally cumbersome to substitute humankind for every reference to mankind, which is taken in the generic. The use of the word man will also have to be generic, as Abdu'l-Baha says that it is. Finally, I've decided to refer most often to parents as mothers and children as boys, although I do spread out a bit. It only seems fair that the males should learn from the women. And indeed, since mothers have primacy as first educators, we do so honor them. Why do we need a new race of men? This paper takes about 40 minutes, I hope. The answer is both individual and collective. Collectively, it means the race must be able to solve the world's problems and have the capacity to build the promised kingdom of God on earth. Individually, it means human beings should have the opportunity to reach their destiny and become fully human. This opportunity depends on education. Inherently or potentially, we all possess this destiny. Only a proper education is necessary for future generations to express more and more of God's design for the human station. Of course, the coming into being of this new race of men is one process. In the Baha'i Position Statement on Education for All, issued this last March in 1989 by the Task Force on Education at the International Teaching Center, we find the following, quote, "Rapid transformation of human society, due among other factors to the exponential progress of science and technology, requires a new human being, an individual with greatly developed power and adaptability, with well-trained intellectual capabilities, and above all, with high moral standards, who can use education to the benefit of him, herself, and the whole of mankind. The success and failure of every socio-political system, in the last analysis, depends on the existence and strength of an enlightened citizenry with a firmly founded moral orientation. As stated," that's end quote, "as stated, the world of the future will take more than intelligence or genius, though it will certainly take that. It will take character and moral leadership before such intellectual individuals will be trusted, before they can be worthy of the trust. Moreover, ultimately, the crises and problems in the world are not technological as much as they are moral. There is something terribly immoral and selfish about an age in which we can put a man on the moon while 3 million children a year die because they cannot even get a drink of clean water. Yet morality is conditioned upon knowledge, is it not? The resolution of the will to solve these problems first stems from the knowledge of what is right, and this only the prophets can teach us. Our reception of it as religionists is objective, while the rest of the world receives it unconsciously or subjectively. To be moral, we must know a lot, and since what one knows is one of the measures of intelligence, or at least one type of intelligence, perhaps we should avoid thinking that moral training is different than intellectual development. Perhaps it is more accurate to say that moral development is a form of intellectual development. Our sacred writings teach us that early intellectual and spiritual attainments are not dichotomous. Likewise, the early education of mental and artistic capacities are not contrary to social and emotional development. In fact, they can augment social and emotional development because children who are more competent and can do more feel better about themselves in social situations. Moreover, the same learning processes and presentation methods can be used for spiritual content as well as secular content. Furthermore, spiritual principles can be taught while exploring the material world with the microscopes and telescopes of science. For example, in the words of the Task Force on Education, quote, "Teaching science and scientific methods and encouraging the children and youth to acquire the latest and most modern scientific knowledge helps them to break away from prejudices and idle fancies." End quote. I might note that many of our sciences prove the oneness of mankind. Thus, science can be used to impart moral education. In addition, the God of creation becomes more wondrous for a child as he discovers the greatness of what has been created by God. Of course, there is the danger of distractions from the material world, but Baha'u'llah tells us, quote, "Whatever is in the heavens and whatever is on earth is a direct evidence of the revelation within it of the attributes and names of God, inasmuch as within every atom are enshrined the signs that bear eloquent testimony to the revelation of that most great light." End quote. If we think of these things, in the world as separate from spiritual reality, if we think of the things in the world as separate from the spiritual reality, they will be separated by our thought. On the other hand, if we see them through but a single lens, they will be viewed as different aspects of a single reality. In either case, they will be experienced from within the spiritual state of our consciousness, the plane of our thought. Each individual has but one soul and one brain through which all this is processed, both the secular and the spiritual. Not one reserved for the secular, one for the holy. As Paul Tillich once wrote, quote, "The separation of the holy from the secular is a symptom of man's estrangement from himself, of his predicament in time and space." End quote. Thus, by logic as well as the writings, we have the guidance as to the kind of education our children should have. In sum, quote, "If the child be trained to be both learned and good, the result is light upon light." End quote. Early intellectual and spiritual attainments are not inherently in opposition to each other. They are not dichotomous. The education of mothers as the first educators of humanity. Perhaps more than anything else, Baha'i marriage is an agreement to become the first educators of the next generation of humanity. We all know the quotes which show that the primary purpose of marriage is the procreation of children, that both parents are accountable before God for the children's education. Thus, the partnership of marriage is largely a partnership in education. The role of the mother as educator requires partnership. Even if the mother works outside the home, her role as teacher should be given priority, which may mean that the parents may have to make sure that the mother's secondary duties are taken care of by someone else while she fulfills this primary function. In consideration of the theme of this conference, full partnership, let me quote from selections from the writings of Abdu'l-Baha. He says, "It is the duty of the father and mother to train the children both in good character and the study of books, study, that is, to the degree required, so that no child will remain illiterate." End quote. And of course, Baha'u'llah himself, in the Kitab-i-Aqdas, gives the father this following special obligation. "Unto every father hath been enjoined the instruction of his son and daughter in the art of reading and writing, and in all that hath been laid down in the holy tablet." End quote. Still, it is obvious from a 1974 letter to an individual believer from the Universal House of Justice that the mother has a unique function. Quote, "That the first teacher of the child is the mother should not be startling, for the primary orientation of the infant is to its mother. This provision of nature in no wise minimizes the role of the father in the Baha'i family. Again, equality of status does not mean identity of function." End quote. How can the father, the society, and especially the Baha'i community help the mother? There is little, if any, social policy in the outside community to support her in her role. So, what is the Baha'i social or administrative policy? I think that we find the beginnings of it in the following quote of Abdu'l-Baha. Quote, "So long as the mother faileth to train her children and start them on the proper way of life, the training which they receive later on will not take its full effect. It is incumbent upon spiritual assemblies to provide mothers with a well-planned program for the education of children, showing how from infancy the child must be watched over and taught. These instructions must be given to every mother to serve as her guide." End quote. This quote obviously refers to parent education and the responsibility Baha'i assemblies have to provide it. They must provide it, but can they develop it? It is not talking about children's classes, for Abdu'l-Baha has indicated that the gathering together of children for the purposes of education should occur at age 5, an age after infancy is over. The above quote refers to the kind of education children should receive prior to community education. As members of an association of Baha'i scholars, must we not ask ourselves, what is the role of scholarship in helping Baha'i assemblies develop such programs? This responsibility of assemblies goes even further than helping the mothers. I think most of us already know that the ultimate responsibility for education of the child rests with the assembly, but how many of us see this responsibility as beginning in infancy? Here's a quote which indicates that responsibility for the earliest education cannot simply be deferred to mothers, or that a mother's failure to provide it would be their failure alone. Quote, "There are certain pillars which have been established as the unshakable supports of the faith of God. The mightiest of these is learning and the use of the mind, the expansion of consciousness and insight into the realities of the universe and the hidden mysteries of Almighty God. To promote knowledge is thus an inescapable duty imposed on every one of the friends of God. It is incumbent upon that spiritual assembly, that assemblage of God, to exert every effort to educate the children, so that from infancy they will be trained." As we begin to analyze, end quote, what the educational programs of assemblies might contain, let us look at the following general and specific guidelines from the writings, what we should have as Baha'is in the way of a well-planned program or curriculum for our children. Is still a very open question, but one which Abdu'l-Baha says we should eventually agree upon, beginning with our children as infants. Quote, "Education is essential in all standards of training and teaching throughout the world of mankind should be brought into conformity and agreement. A universal curriculum should be established, and the basics of ethics be the same," end quote. Again, quote, elsewhere, "Suckle your children from their infancy with the milk of universal education." And in the same quote, he mentions again the earliest days, end quote. To reemphasize the period of infancy and to suggest what the curriculum should contain, I wish to include the following Baha'i quotes, and I'm going to try to paraphrase them for the sake of time. You can acquire a copy of this as a compilation we put together if you wish. It says the children should be given good training from the earliest childhood. They must be given systematic training, and beginning in childhood, they must receive instruction. Many elementary sciences must be made clear to them in the nursery. And again, elsewhere, every child without exception must, from his earliest years, make a thorough study of the art of reading and writing, and according to his own taste and inclinations and degree of his receptivity, capacity, and powers, devote extreme diligence to the acquisition of learning, beneficial arts and skills, various languages, speech, and contemporary technology. Again, he said, from the earliest years. End quote. From the following quotes, it is evident that something very special and perhaps unique is going on in the development of these earliest years. Quote, "Educate the children in their infancy." Again, so that mothers may educate their little ones from the earliest days. Train the children from the earliest babyhood, from his infancy, from the very beginning. Encourage the children from their earliest years to master every kind of learning and make them eager to become skilled in every art. Again, while the children are yet in their infancy, give them the advantage and every useful kind of knowledge. Let them share in every new and wondrous craft and art. Bring them up to work and strive. Teach them, to inspire them to undertake studies, yet in their infancy. It seems clear that there's something very special about the period of infancy, the nursery, the earliest years. For our purposes here, let us at least define it as the age range from 0 through the 3rd year, or the 48th month. We could not possibly interpret earliest as not including these first 48 months, since it is impossible to conceive of anything earlier than the first few years. And to say that the category referred to a later period would be equivalent to saying that the first few years did not even exist. These first few years must be within the category earliest, by definition. Logically, it would seem the earlier the age, the greater the chance it would fall into Abdu'l-Baha's category of earliest years and infancy. It would seem, I tried to nail that one down. It also seems clear that there is something very special or unusual about what we should be teaching our infant babies. In addition to spiritual values, manners, and morals, the list includes reading, writing, sciences, contemporary technology, and the arts. We must know that this is not only possible, but necessary, and that it is our responsibility, since Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi have enjoined it upon us. It may be that the what is only possible if we understand the when, and that the how naturally follows after that. My first appeal is for parents to consider certain evidences of science, presented briefly in this paper, that enriching experiences or early learning interactions with the environment during fetal development and infancy are far more important than we have previously conceived, that they actually create neurological structures, even before birth, that they determine the anatomy of the brain and actually generate new intelligence, both spiritual intelligence and secular. Intelligence is beyond anything we could say that is only genetically determined. There is a host of evidence from neurobiology, cognitive science, and clinical practice to support the idea that the possibilities for learning in infancy go far beyond what we have ever really considered. The responsibility of parents to educate their child begins even before birth, first with the nutrition and emotional state of the mother. It appears that the emotional receptivity of the child begins before birth. Prenatal research by Thomas Verney at the University of Toronto and Anthony DeCasper at the University of North Carolina indicates that mothers actually transfer their emotions to their unborn child. Mothers who are calm have calmer babies. Anxious mothers have babies who are anxiety-ridden. This may be partly hormonal, but it may also be mental. Those of us who have children know from our own experience as parents that our children pick up on our very thoughts. Even our attitudes towards our children has a prognostic effect. As Abdu'l-Baha said, the eye traineth everything. Very young children, infants, can learn far more than we imagine, and various types of learning during infancy have lasting effects into adulthood because brain structures are built out of that learning. The quality of learning interactions with the environment not only set the spiritual and moral directions for the child, but actually can determine the anatomy of the brain. Thus, the lasting effects into adulthood are measurable not only in terms of behavior, but also exist in the form of brain structures which serve as tools the individual will have to work with for the rest of his or her life. Without the enriching experiences during the critical periods of early brain development, some structures may not even exist. Let me explain what I mean by that from an example. Here's some evidence from science why later than early is too late. In cats, for example, the critical period for visual development is from the 3rd through the 5th weeks. If during that period you deprive a cat's eye from either form or light, it will never function. The cat will be functionally blind in that eye for the rest of its life. It will even lack the structures. Anatomy itself can be determined by the environment. Howard Gardner writes, irreversible damage to the central nervous system seems particularly likely to occur in the wake of even mild restrictions to the sensory pathways during the critical period. Conversely, rapid development will occur if the proper conditions obtained during the critical period. In order to get a more precise understanding of what is a sensitive or critical period during infancy, let me give you Gardner's definition. A sensitive period is a period during development when the organism is particularly prone to learn or develop in a certain area. A critical period is a specific interval when certain physical or psychological events must occur if an organism's development is to proceed normally. In neurobiological terms, a sensitive period becomes a critical period when the opportunity to develop part of the brain is lost forever unless a corresponding or relevant stimulus from the environment occurs. That is the definition. The most important periods of opportunity always occur during the earliest or formative periods of the brain's development. With respect to these critical windows in time, Gardner has written, with respect to some forms of development, it makes sense to posit critical periods. These are intervals, sometimes lasting hours, sometimes months, during which the capacity is programmed to emerge, and some flexibility is possible. After the conclusion of the period, neural systems become fully committed to specific functions, and there may no longer be an opportunity for the normal development of an ability or capacity. Hubble 79, Lorenz 71. During such critical periods, it is crucial for the organism to inhabit a properly enriched environment where it can partake of relevant sensory experiences and activities. Greenough, 1976. Rearing during this period in an impoverished environment or one deficit, improper triggers, can have a deleterious long-term effect. The effects of enrichment and deprivation conditions can now be demonstrated by measuring the size of the brain regions, number or density of synaptic connections, and other relatively hard measures of neuronal organization. Greenough, Rosenweg, Sibyl. Deprivation retards, that's the end of the quote. I'm continuing. Deprivation retards, limits, or completely inhibits neurological development, while enrichment causes augmentation, improvement, and in some cases entirely new structures which would not exist otherwise. Thus, new experiences or new interactions, even repeated over generations, new interactions with the environment are even the catalysts of evolution. The impact of the environment on the anatomy of the brain. Just as the cat's eye expects certain inputs from the environment for its development, other parts of the brain expect certain learning experiences for theirs. Else there's a serious omission, and possibilities are lost, for the critical window in time is lost. It remains then for us to determine whether it is more accurate to call these special environmental influences, or early learning experiences, as enriching. Should we call them enriching, or simply as necessary? We may have been living under a misnomer. If they are necessary, then much of what educators thought was optional may now be regarded as a responsibility. For example, such may be the case with teaching your child to read before she reaches school age. Of course, a child can learn to read after infancy, but that child may not have some of the special structures, like a network of cells which not only provide high-level visual pattern recognition, which is one way to define reading, but also have spillover effects to increased powers of memory and mental processing from the benefit of having the structure. Vygotsky's research would certainly support this notion, since he argues that literacy skills are fundamental to higher-order competencies, or cognitive functioning like abstract thinking, or being able to apply principles. I've seen children who learn to read in infancy reach Piaget's level of formal operations, which he sets at between 10 and 12 years of age, by the time they were 3 years old. The biological basis of intelligence is no longer thought to refer only to genetic endowment individuals have. Nurturing from the environment is as important in that basis as is nature, even in biology. In the last decade, discoveries in neurobiology and the relatively new field of cognitive science indicate that biological bases of intelligence can be seen as a result of the learning experiences or interactions with the environment. Learning, which is usually sustained by some interaction with the environment, must now be thought of in terms of creating brain structures or altering the anatomy of the brain. Furthermore, considerable evidence is mounting to indicate that the kinds of learning experiences during the earliest years are much more important than previously thought. During early development, enriched interactions with the environment augment the number, the pattern, the qualities of synaptic connections in the nervous system. Learning translates directly into the size of the relevant nuclei, the number of neurons, and the extent of connections between them. In fact, it may no longer be possible to define learning without this effect being included in the definition. These effects are particularly significant during infancy because structures can be built then that can never exist if they're not built then. This is not hypothetical. Recently, it's been discovered that after the selection of cells for a specific function, there's a pruning or deletion of those cells which are not dedicated to that function. In other words, once the critical period is over, quote, the flexibility, I'm quoting Gardner again here, the flexibility of youth, the very first few years, is at an end. The number of neurons is adjusted to match the size of the field they're designed to innervate. That's kind of scientific jargon, but let me bring it home to some other level. In addition to utilizing increased innervation and increased networking among synaptic structures, the children who evidence accelerated abilities may also be turning on more of their new brain. It's useful for the moment to think of man as having 3 brains, not the left, right, and the whole brain, but say the reptile or mammal and the human brain. The human brain is the new brain in terms of evolutionary time, as you know. Some scientists estimate that we only use 5% of our human brain, the cerebral cortex, or the center of abstract thought and reflection. In 1980, John Lober published an article in the Scientific American called, Is Your Brain Really Necessary? It created quite a stir because it presented the findings of the top scientists who'd found that there were many people, victims of hydrocephalus and so on, who had virtually no new brain structure at all, whose IQs were about 120, who had PhDs and who were functioning on a professional level. One scientist had only about 10% of the gray matter the rest of us do because as a child the fluid in his skull had pushed it all aside and replaced most of it. But they found that what little he had was turned on, that there was a much hotter level of activity which they could observe and measure by modern medical electronics. The conclusion we can draw from all of this is that the brain may indeed grow a better brain to be used during the rest of the person's life if exposed to enriching learning opportunities during infancy. Knowing this information implies new responsibilities for parents as first educators of their child, since all this happens before a child's ready to go to school. The way in which learning opportunities are given to a child determines, of course, whether the child is enriched or put at some risk, cognitively, emotionally, or socially. Something else must be said about education as something the organism expects. Did you hear that? Something else must be said about education as something which the organism expects to come to it. Sunlight is training for the eye, for example. On a neurological level, the eye learns. What it learns is sunlight. In fact, it is inconceivable to think that the eye was designed without the sun in mind. The design of the eye presupposes the existence of the sun. They are in relation as one system, a part of the same design. So it may also be with the education and the release of other potentialities. Language exists in man as a part of the template or design. But if a child is not exposed to hearing it, the language center will not develop. The language potentiality of the brain expects a culture out there to elicit it. The same may be true for literacy, because we know that a 2-year-old can learn to read with only moderate triggering. And as with language, it seems to become more difficult as one gets older. Let me give you some visions of possibilities. Given the proper enriched environment, investing only 1.5 minutes a day of high-quality interaction with a reading methodology, in addition to simply reading to the child, over a period of, let's say, 8 months, any 2-year-old with the developmental prerequisites can learn to read as well as a 4th grader. This has been clinically demonstrated in individual after individual. What if, in fact, it is much easier than it would be for the same child if he begins at 4, 5, or 6? What if it's easier for him when he's 2? Among other things, by easier, I mean that he only had to concentrate on it for 10 seconds, 5 or 6 times a day over the 8-month period. The accumulated time over the 8-month period would be less than 8 hours total. Would we call that a miracle? Hardly. There's evidence that even brain-damaged infants have been able to achieve similar results using the same methodology. Spillover effects of this reading ability seem obvious to parents when their 2-year-old child can, without solicitation, tell them that stethoscope, spelled with an E, which is misspelled, they can tell you that it's misspelled because they'd seen stethoscope in another book, 2-year-old. So there's something else going on as a result of this ability to read. This ability is obviously based on highly detailed visual memory. Likewise, the ability of a 2-year-old to recognize the artist of a painting from his style, after having seen only one other painting by that artist of an entirely different content several weeks before. These visual processing abilities begin to seem almost uncanny when you can throw 63 pennies on the ground and the infant can instantly tell you without counting what the correct number is. Another example is the ability of a 4-year-old to be able to tell you what violin piece you're playing when all you have is the mime motion of the violin, of the playing, without even a violin in your hands. Jonathan Slevin, in a 1986 Smithsonian Magazine article titled "Geniuses Are Made, Not Born, and How It Is Done," describes one of these children as also having incredible mathematical abilities. 3-year-old Michael has no problem mentally calculating the square root of 1,936 minus 5 squared in a jiffy. Multiplying 192 by 192 is too easy for him. Another example of spillover effects ability of a spillover ability, which uses high-level visual discrimination and memory, is the ease with which a child who has learned to read well by the time they are 3 can learn all the countries of the world. This they can do literally in 1 month with an investment of only 1 minute a day. Take a map of the world and with all the names of the countries blocked out, point to any country and they can tell you what it is. Even more impressive is their ability to recognize any country merely by its shape, even when not surrounded by the context of the other countries in proximity to it. I believe that any child who has the structure for high-level visual pattern recognition in place can accomplish this learning feat. Again, the idea here is that the special structure can only be built while learning to read. And since reading seems to be the highest form of visual pattern recognition, other feats are easier and easier. And of course, this is not just an exercise to strengthen the child's mental abilities. It gives the child a sense of the world, this particular example, and that the world is their home, and gives them a greater sense of appreciation for the words in the writings which say, quote, "He hath created the whole world, and all that liveth and moveth therein," end quote. And of course, this appreciation can be further enhanced if the child knows all the animal kingdom and the major scientific inventions, etc. There's no end to what they can learn if they're turned on. Highly motivated, they have to be highly motivated and have parents who have a well-planned program with a proper methodology. 4-year-old child can do this. How many adults can do this? Keep in mind that these are normal children, simply with abnormal parents, who play unusual and creative games with them. It seems that any child can do this, given developmental readiness and a proper methodology. What seems necessary for optimum results is to create a heightened sense of curiosity and concentration in the child. Suzuki, the developer of the Suzuki Music Talent Education, claims, and we have seen it, that an almost perfect memory can evolve in these turned-on kids. A normal 2-year-old can easily learn to read 10 to 15 new words a day and never forget them once this memory capacity is developed. Moreover, after the memory structure is in place, a 3-year-old can quickly decode new words she's never seen before, like manifold, fountain, outpourings, fortitude. Like the scientists who induce laws from raw facts and raw data, she has discovered the rules and principles of phonics without ever having been taught phonics. It would be interesting to do a study of people who have superior visual memory abilities, such as photographic memory, and see how many of them learn to read at a very young age. But my contention is that, given a proper education, the possibility exists that any of us could have had these abilities. I'm suggesting that we make sure our children do have such pervasive effects from literacy and other enriching experiences by giving them to them at a young age. Gardner has written, quote, "Many scientific or artistic breakthroughs, such as the calculus from Newton or the theory of evolution from Darwin, initially began as unique domains but can now be mastered by large segments of a culture. And perhaps the same thing occurred in the remote past in such cultural domains as map-making or reading. Perhaps it is time for a quantum leap in reading once again. And perhaps, as Baha'is, we will begin to use new methodologies not only to completely eradicate illiteracy from our community, as the House of Justice has asked us to do, but also perhaps we will begin to understand the real meaning of super-learning. That is, so our children will be able to learn in a month what it takes a year for other children to learn. If we take this literally, we're talking of at least 12-to-1 gains. I must reemphasize that all this effort takes very little of the child's time and can exist as a form of fun and play. The only time it need replace is the time which they're bored or the time they waste on TV. Not that all TV time's wasted, but there is time wasted with TV. We've been talking about intellectual powers and precocious abilities which are normally associated with child prodigies. The difference is, of course, that prodigies usually concentrate in one domain, whereas Baha'i children are expected to have a comprehensive education. We must consider how these abilities can be used to help our children become better Baha'is, whose lives are spiritualized not just more intelligent human beings. The importance of literacy in this whole process has not been adequately explored in this regard, so we will have to continue to explore this subject together over the coming years. It is central, this question of literacy is central to both intellectual development and spiritual progress. The benefits of having it earlier may be numerous in both the spiritual and intellectual domains. Quote from Gardner, "More than one scientist has speculated that the extremely rapid learning of the young child, for example in the area of language, may reflect an exploitation of the large number of synapses available at that time during the critical period." End quote. It seems very likely that attainment of reading competency in infancy will create brain structures out of cells which would otherwise be deleted or dedicated to some other function, and that early literacy has even greater pervasive or spillover effects on memory and intelligence. And intelligence may depend on memory in some ways. May have greater spillover effects than psychologists and cognitive science are arguing exist for adults, if it happens in infants. Here's some final thoughts on reading education in infancy. Chomsky, one of the foremost linguists of our time, has posited the notion of a language organ in the brain. This potential exists as a, quote, prepotent tendency, he says, and requires only modest triggering for its activation. An infant can easily learn 2 or 3 languages simply by being in an environment with them during the language acquisition period of the brain's development. Perhaps the ability to read also exists as a tendency which only needs triggering. That it is a part of God's design for the reality of man. That you cannot think of the definition of man without this ability. When we hear the July 10th, 1989 Universal House of Justice Statement on Literacy to all the National Spiritual Assemblies, we cannot imagine that an illiterate man is any more perfect than the cat's eye, which cannot see. And I quote, "Dear Baha'i friends, the Holy Word has been extolled by the prophets of God as the medium of celestial power and the wellspring of all spiritual, social, and material progress. Access to it, constant study of it, and daily use of it in our individual lives are vital to the inner and outer manifestation." Daily use of it in our individual lives are vital to the inner personal transformation towards which we strive and whose ultimate outer manifestation will be the emergence of that divine civilization which is the promise of the world order of Baha'u'llah. You have this quote in your packet, by the way. The most immediate access to the dynamic influence of the sacred word is through reading. The ability to read is therefore a fundamental right and privilege of every human being. Baha'u'llah promotes this right in his command to parents to ensure the instruction of their sons and daughters in the art of reading and writing. For this essential reason, in our last Rizvan message, we called attention to the need for systematic attention to be given to eventually eliminating illiteracy from the Baha'i community. This matter must assume its proper importance as a continuing objective of that community. Let each national and local spiritual assembly, according to the necessity and circumstances, address itself to this objective. Tomorrow, during my talk during the plenary session, I will cover this idea of a literacy organ in greater detail and how the reading ability can greatly accelerate children's spiritual progress. Now I have a two-paragraph summary. Contrary to popular opinion that tiny children in infancy don't know much and can't learn very much, scientific evidence shows that it is precisely during the earliest years that the quantity and efficiency of learning for human is greater than it will ever be again at any other period during its life. It is this period when the brain is developing most rapidly, a period covering what cognitive scientists refer to as concurrent synaptogenesis, the initial making of connections among brain cells. And it is in this period and somewhat beyond, for example, that a child can easily learn 2 or 3 languages simultaneously while an adult finds it exceedingly difficult to learn one. So there is something terribly wrong with the general attitude towards tiny children which says they are inferior. There's a tremendous awareness missing when we say, oh, she's just a child. Parents, and in particular mothers, within whose trust they are placed, are given the charge to guide the learning of the most powerful learning entity in the universe during its most critical and rapid period of development. We have vast and rich source of guidance in the Baha'i writings on this subject, so that Baha'i parents can become aware of their true station as parents and of their parental responsibilities as educators. What can an association of Baha'i scholars do to facilitate this parent education and awareness? I invite us to join each other in this effort.
I think I understand here a little bit why when my brain is stimulated like that, I feel childlike again. I'm feeling that way now. That was really quite interesting. We have, it occurred to me while I was listening too, how, what a good example we have here of Baha'i scholarship. Not that Baha'i scholarship is always so left brain, but Greg did such a good job of relating the Baha'i writings and the current thoughts of the best scholarship available. And then I thought, well, too, he uses that, just knowing him, how much of that scholarship is based on collaboration. As I watched Mernouche, knowing how much their family works with this collaboration. I think that's part of his scholarship here. And then in terms of translating into action, I hope sometime during the day you'll have a chance to meet their children and see how he has put this into action. We have a problem and an opportunity. The problem is that we were half an hour late starting, and we're trying to make up that time, and I want to respect the education committees that we've given an hour and a half to. But I also think we should take a little time here to have some interaction with Greg. I think he wanted to have a chance for questions or reactions. I know if I can use my prerogative here, I have a reaction or a question. You mentioned over and over again the word enriched environment, and at one point you used the term quality time. And in these, in the decade that's ending, those terms are have significance in yuppiedom. And it occurred to me that we need to be careful that this definition of an enriched environment is not a materialistic definition.
Good point.
And I wonder what your thoughts are as to what a spiritually enriched environment. Understanding that there's not this dichotomy between material world and spiritual world, but between a spiritualistic enrichment as opposed to a materialistic enrichment. And speak up so the mic. Why don't you come up here?
I think that I'm trying to learn more about this from my wife, and it seems that, of course, by enriched environment or enriching environment, we're not talking about material things or providing a bunch of toys around them, but mainly that attention is given to the learning process, that the mother or the father has a focus on the child, and that focus is a primary part of the experience of that child in the environment. So when parents are running hither and yon, rushing the children, get them up, get them dressed, send them off to school or daycare, or drag them from shopping place to shopping place. And the focus is not on the child. I think there you have a hurried child, resulting from a hurried parent. And the effort to try to provide learning opportunities as a form of play is more of a enrichment that I'm speaking of.
What is the difference in the effect of, you talked about the visual pattern and memory, at that point the development of it with respect to real visions as opposed to artificial visions, video, television, the screen on a computer being used for visual?
I don't think there's any difference. I think you have to be able to judge wisely how you could use video. It's not as interactive. Although there's the latest research indicates that television does not make children passive, but you certainly have to be selective about the programming and not let it substitute for things you can do in an interactive way directly with your child on a one-to-one human basis. I think the visual pattern is the same. Except for depth perception. Yes, but depth perception is also processed by several cues that are present in the two-dimensional screen, like railroad converging, relative size difference. But they already have to have good depth perception before they can psychologically impose it over the two-dimensional surface. So you've got to make sure the prerequisites are there, or you can't benefit from it fully. If you start them too young with that, they'll lose out on other development. Yeah. Right.
My question, although I'm trying to clarify it in my mind, and I think I have it, but where you're speaking of this early input in the early 80s, actually. There is a trend now in elementary school education not to teach reading in kindergarten, to relax this hurry, and they use that same term, hurry the child. Do not hurry that child. And even Abdul Baha'i says, in our early childhood classes, we work on love and courtesy and not the knowledge component in our early classes. So I think now the key is what we were saying, enrichment in terms of play, enrichment in terms of the way we do it with our children. But I think that's a consideration. Mm-hmm. The method that we employ to enrich and stimulate the child.
Absolutely. And this hurried child controversy was formalized by Elkind and referred to as the kind of imposing of the kinds of curriculum and learning processes on children that don't even work well with older children. I mean, the system's not doing too well getting them literate when we've got 20 to 40% of the ones who actually graduate from high school still functionally illiterate, and 75% of the people in prisons are illiterate, and over 800 million to a billion people on the planet are illiterate. The school systems aren't doing too well. So to take those methods that they employ there and push them down, pushing the curriculum down, is not something Baha'is are asked to do. There's no reason why the things that are failing to work in preschools should have implications or detract from what parents can do with their children at home. Mary?
I'm thinking in some ways that our education system now is trying to make up for our time lost. It looks like we missed the early critical and sensitive years, and so now our process is in place even after the fact.
Remediation. Adult literacy classes are very fashionable, of course.
But I was thinking, wondering whether any of the Mandela College kind of things may have credibility. As a physical therapist, I was reviewing it, and I thought it was good primarily because the investment of time and getting people invested in that system, that success was the natural outcome. That you're going to do that as you perceive others or taking their time. You know how now the parents are getting their children to read early on, and I thought it was an exercise of parental pride a lot of times, to say that. But it may be that what they're doing is using but the potential was there. It may be balanced with the reason behind it all.
Absolutely.
But the fact is they're doing these things, and children multi-sensory stimulated, and they just come out with this cognition very early. And I was wondering if you know about whether that Institute for Development of Human Potential has more credibility than it did.
I think there's more than one question there. And Marnish, would you like to answer that question? Which one of the questions?
Credibility. I agree with you that
Would you like to come up here?
Yeah, come on up. Or just speak loudly.
I think she should come here.
I agree with you about the motivation behind doing all this, and a lot of people who have who've got the motivation to do it for one reason or another, and have done a lot of damage to the whole process, because they've, as you said, the ego and the pride comes in, and you convey those feelings to the child. You turn the child into a showpiece, and in all ways you can affect it, the child, and you do make mistakes, and so the result turns out to be not desirable. So it attracts the attention, and then the whole process is rejected by people. Doman and Delcara, you mentioned. I think they do have a lot of credibility, and at the same time they've got badly misunderstood by people for the same reason I mentioned. And but during the last 2 years, we found out that their work is being more and more recognized, especially in academic world. So if that.
And
a few thoughts that are kind of similar to a few thoughts that are sort of similar to the others, and concerns you want to talk about coming from mine too. I'm wondering, and I really think I appreciate very much and in fact it reminded me somewhat of Dan Jordan's presentation sometimes, and he did a lot of study on the neurological aspects of learning along with some of the other wider studies and development too. And so I thought about him a little bit when he was speaking, and I appreciate you reviewing some of those things. Now, at the same time, I can't help but think of one thing to some extent, whether, the way that we use that knowledge cannot become biased heavily by the Western push towards cognitive achievement and all the standardized tests that are being imposed on our children only test out their reading and math ability, and has sort of divided up our nation into those people who do well in these tests and those people who don't. And I was very interested in research that was being done in Indianapolis in the public school system, where they had identified 7 or 8 different kinds of intelligences in which they had children playing games and choosing games, and on the basis of what kinds of games they chose and how they played with other children, diagnostics processes were going on by teachers in the room, and we began to realize what the children's strengths and weaknesses were, and were able to help them to work on developing their strengths further and helping to address their weaknesses. And children began to talk about each other's strengths and weaknesses and kinds of intelligence, and I thought that was a really interesting, and I'd like to know more about it. But in addition to that, I don't know what all those kinds of intelligences are, but in addition to that, I can't help but think about some of the writings in which the master wrote to Shosei Fendi, who was a very small boy at the time, and wanted Abdu'l-Baha to reveal tablets and so forth to him. And he did not have time for reading and writing and study. The time for jumping about and playing and shouting, "Oh my God, oh my God." And also when we hear Hanum was a child, and some others were studying about some of the things that she was doing, Abdu'l-Baha said, emphasized giving her, something of a freedom and spontaneity, because in the future her life would become, she had many burdens to carry now, and it was allowing a child to develop that part of her nature, which is spiritual, spontaneous, and joyous. I would hope that too much emphasis on early development of cognitive processes might not jeopardize that. And it could get out of hand. I could feel that in our culture and society, that it could get out of hand, and it could restrict the child's development of a full personality in a joyous and happy way. I still have a bias that I would much rather see my 2.5-year-old, shouting, "Oh my God," and kissing Abdu'l-Baha's picture, and loving people and showing that love and affection and respect for people of all different kinds, and showing reverence. And I would to see him sitting down and always rested down, those are the books, and we love, because it's in our kind of culture, then to force them into reading at this particular point in time. So those are some of the things that rise to the surface of my consciousness just listening to this, both. And I don't know whether there are questions or just, I would just like to urge you to give a consideration to all this, not to allow ourselves to get into the Western mode too much.
Of course, there are dangers, and 2 points come to my mind, and I think she may have others. One is you should never force your child to learn anything, and that if you're going to teach them something, reading, the model I presented was a minute a day, working with the child as a form of play. Even that could be done in a forceful way if the parent were not aware of those dangers. And of course, I think the concern I have is almost the opposite in a way, and that tends to filter through the paper from maybe some of the emphasis on the Western, if you want to call it Western, science. But the concern I have is that we not neglect either the spiritual development or the intellectual attainments, and that we have neglected the intellectual attainments based on what I think the writings tell us we should be teaching our children. That's why I shared those particular quotes with you. I think also that the question of whether you do it or not, are you trading something for it? Is the child losing out on being a child? Is the child losing out on play or fun or the experience of being a child? And if she is, then I would certainly say you shouldn't do it. But if you're not trading any of that, maybe all you're trading is a few moments of boredom or time that they would waste, and you make it an exciting and enjoyable adventure, they benefit from it greatly. And they also gain spiritual progress, which is the focus of the talk tomorrow. It's sort of the other half of this. Mariners, did you have a comment on that?
No.
Okay.
I understand, and I agree with you that it has a lot to do with the process and the way it's done. And you can get, with good intention, anything that is good. If you're not using it right, then you can do damage.
You can abuse a child while teaching them moral development.
Yes.
Punishing them, but telling them they're doing wrong.
Yes.
It's not just the fact that you're abusing them by teaching them to read. You can abuse them while you're teaching them to pray.
And the point here is the parents' involvement and interaction with the child. And you all know as parents that children, especially when they're smaller, they won't trade any toy with having you Am I saying it correct or reverse? They prefer to have 1 minute interaction with you as a parent than any other toy that you would suggest. And that is what you really use in this whole process of education of the child. The setting is loving, home, supportive, and it's centered around the child's interest. And you don't make a school out of what you're doing. Don't put formality and structure that much to it. Just follow the child's spontaneity and excitement and curiosity. So that's a very valid concern to have, because you don't want to see the child to forget about the world and interaction with people and become a bookworm. So.
I thought Abdu'l-Baha said they should become bookworms.
There was some question.
Remember our schedule.
Yeah.
I'm going to be real mean here and break in, because I know there's some more questions and comments, but we're right on schedule in terms of when we started. But as I said, we're half an hour behind because we started late. And I do need to give people a chance to have a break. Perhaps during the break, if you have more comments or questions for the Watsons.